The order came from the highest authority in vampire society, and it was absolute. Zarek Drakul was to stand guard outside Blackthorn Academy's east corridor every evening from dusk until midnight, and he was to ignore the human teacher who worked late in classroom 14. Ignore her entirely, pretend she did not exist. Treat her as furniture, as air, as something beneath the notice of a vampire who had survived 6 centuries of blood wars and court betrayals. The order had been clear. The order had been given by Lord Valdris Nocturne himself, the ruling elder of the Eastern Vampire Court, and it had been delivered with the kind of quiet menace that reminded every vampire in Zarek's position exactly what happened to those who failed their assignments. Zarek had followed that order for exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, Marina Winslow stayed 2 hours later than usual, and when he heard her voice crack through the silence of the empty hallway, not in fear, not in weakness, but in pure furious defiance at the phone pressed against her ear, saying, "You threaten my students again, and I will walk into every newspaper in this city with what I know." He stopped pretending. He turned. He looked through the narrow window of classroom 14. He watched this woman. This small human woman with dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her head and chalk dust on her blazer sleeve, stand in the center of a room full of empty desks and speak to someone on the other end of that phone with the kind of iron courage most vampires only pretended to possess. Her hands were shaking, her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously like the specific kind of bravery that got people killed. He knew, in that moment, that ignoring Marina Winslow was the one order he would never be able to keep. What he did not know yet was how deeply that single broken order would pull both of them into a trap that had been set centuries before either of them were born. Blackthorn Academy was not an ordinary school. It existed in the outer borough of a city that had been quietly divided between human and vampire territory for the better part of 200 years since the signing of the Meridian Accord, the ancient vow that promised existence so long as neither side reached into the other's affairs without invitation. The academy sat on neutral ground, technically speaking, though everything about the building, from its Gothic stone arches to its iron-gated courtyard, suggested it had been designed with vampire aesthetics in mind. It served human students during daylight hours, and served as a secondary meeting point for lower vampire court officials during the nighttime hours when the human staff was gone, except Marina Winslow was never gone. She had been teaching literature and history at Blackthorn for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had developed a habit of staying well past sunset, grading papers, building lesson plans, researching the kind of obscure historical detail that most human teachers had no reason to care about. She was 28 years old, intellectually relentless, and entirely too perceptive for her own safety. She had noticed things. Small things at first, a hallway that smelled faintly of something ancient and cold, paperwork filed in languages that predated modern nations, portraits on the east corridor walls that depicted people dressed in centuries-old clothing, but with eyes that looked freshly painted, alive in a way oil on canvas should not allow. She had said nothing to anyone. But she had started keeping notes. Zarek had been assigned to the school by Lord Valdris because Zarek was the best. 6 centuries of survival had made him precisely what the Eastern Vampire Court required when it needed a situation monitored without disruption. He was tall, pale as winter marble, with white hair worn loose to his shoulders and eyes, the deep silver grey of storm clouds building before lightning. He wore dark clothing, always, because the court expected it, but on him it looked less like costume and more like armor. He moved through spaces the way predators moved through tall grass, without sound, without waste, with a quality of attention that made everything he observed feel like it was being memorized. The assignment had seemed simple. Watch the perimeter. Ensure the eastern corridor remained clear during court sessions. Keep the human teacher from seeing anything she should not see. Do not interact with her. Do not acknowledge her. Do not allow the situation to become complicated. On the 9th night, Zarek had found himself standing outside classroom 14 for 40 minutes listening to the sound of her writing, the scratch of her pen moving across paper with the kind of focused quiet that somehow carried more presence than shouting. He had walked back to his post and refused to examine why he had stood there so long. On the 10th night, He heard her phone call and turned to look at her, and the pretense was finished. He waited until her call ended. He watched her set the phone down on her desk, press both hands flat against the surface, and breathe through whatever fear she had managed to keep out of her voice during the conversation. Then she straightened, she gathered her papers. She was going to walk out into that corridor alone, in the dark, having just made what sounded very much like a threat against someone powerful enough to be threatening her students in return. And Zarek had been standing in that corridor for 9 nights, and he knew exactly what moved through the eastern wing after 9 o'clock. He stepped to the side of the door as it opened. Marina Winslow walked out of classroom 14 and stopped when she registered the figure in the shadows with the kind of immediate animal awareness that told Zarek she had better instincts than the average human. She did not scream. She did not run. She looked at him with dark eyes that measured and assessed and settled within approximately 3 seconds on something that looked very much like recognition without acquaintance. "You've been out here before," she said. Not a question. Zarek said nothing. He was still technically under orders. 9 nights, she said. Different position each time, but always this corridor. You're not a teacher, you're not maintenance staff. She paused. You're too still to be human. He looked at her for a long moment. The hallway lights were dim. The eastern corridor at this hour was always dim. In the low light, with her blazer slightly rumpled and her chin slightly lifted, and her eyes holding exactly the right measure of controlled fear and deliberate courage, she was the most interesting human being he had encountered in over a century. "You should go home," he said. His voice came out lower than intended, carrying the old-world resonance that centuries sometimes built into a voice without permission. "Someone just threatened my students," she said. "A man on the phone who knew things about my classroom that no one outside this building should know. He told me to stop asking questions about the East Corridor or the evening sessions, and when I told him I hadn't been asking questions, he said I had been noticed regardless." She looked at Zarek steadily. "So I am not going home until someone explains to me what is happening in this school." "That," Zarek said, "is the most dangerous sentence you have ever spoken." "Probably," she agreed. "But I have 17 students who count on me to be the adult in the room when things get frightening, and I have a very strong feeling that what happens in this corridor is directly connected to why 3 of them told me they were too scared to walk home last week." She crossed her arms. "So, are you going to talk to me? Or are you going to keep standing there being extremely pale and intimidating and unhelpful?" Something shifted in his chest. He had no precise name for it, but it felt remarkably like the thing he had spent 6 centuries learning not to feel. "You cannot unknow what I tell you," he said. "I already know enough to be in danger," she said. "Ignorance stopped being an option when that man called my phone." He studied her for another moment, measuring the steadiness of her heartbeat, the deliberate set of her spine, the way she held his gaze without flinching, even as some part of her brain that was wired for survival screamed at her that he was wrong in the specific way that predators are wrong. Then he stepped slightly aside and gestured, barely perceptibly, toward the far end of the corridor, where a recessed alcove held an old stone bench. The only private space in the hallway that was genuinely out of the range of the school's interior cameras. She walked to it without hesitation. He followed at a measured distance, because she had courage, and he would not crowd it. They sat at opposite ends of the bench, which was not quite long enough for the distance to feel comfortable, and Zarek looked at the far wall for a moment before he turned and said, "What do you know about the Meridian Accord?" Her breath changed. Just slightly, he heard it. "The peace treaty between human governing bodies and vampire courts," she said, "signed in 1847. I found references to it in 3 different historical texts that weren't on any curriculum, and then I found a physical copy of the addendum document in the East Wing's archive room 3 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "The archive room is locked. The lock is very old," she said without apology. He almost smiled. He caught it. "The addendum," he said carefully, "contains the blood law provisions, the ones that were not made public." "Yes," she said. "Specifically the provision that states that any human who becomes formally aware of vampire territorial claims in any neutral zone forfeits their protected status and becomes subject to vampire court jurisdiction." She paused. which I assume is what makes me currently dangerous to have alive. The fact that she had read the addendum, understood its implications, identified her own position within its framework, and then chosen to stay and confront the situation rather than flee was, Zarek thought, either the most reckless thing he had ever witnessed or the most genuinely brave. "You understand what you are describing," he said. "I understand that someone in your court, because I assume you are with the Eastern Court, given the building's Eastern orientation, and the portrait in the corridor that matches the court seal I found in the addendum. Called my phone tonight to remind me that I am in danger," she said. "I am choosing to believe that you, specifically, are not here to harm me. You have had 9 nights. That logic could get you killed. The alternative is to run and hope they don't follow," she said. "I looked at those options. Running seems wuss." He turned to look at her fully. Silver-grey eyes meeting dark ones, and the air between them was doing something that 6 centuries of careful emotional management had never prepared him for. "My name is Zarek Drakul," he said. "I am a guardsman of the Eastern Vampire Court. I was assigned to this location to monitor the perimeter and ensure that court activities within the East Corridor remained undiscovered." He paused. "I was explicitly ordered not to engage with you, and yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. Marina Winslow looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "The person who called me. He knew about the archive room, which means someone in this school reported that I had been in there, which means I have been under surveillance for weeks, and the person watching me decided tonight was the right moment to escalate." She tilted her head. "Was that you?" "The person who reported me." "No," he said. The word came out with an absoluteness that surprised even him. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected that answer and simply needed it confirmed. "Then who?" This was the point at which Zarek's careful world became significantly more complicated, because the answer to that question led directly to Lord Valdris Nocturne himself, and the reason the ruling elder of the Eastern Vampire Court had wanted a specific human teacher kept under observation, while simultaneously being told she should be ignored, pointed to a hidden motive that Zarek had been turning over in his mind for 9 nights without arriving at a conclusion he liked. "The order to monitor this school," he said slowly, "came from Lord Valdris, my commanding elder. The provision that allows court jurisdiction over aware humans is real, but it has not been enforced in over 60 years because the Accord's human signatories included a mutual protection clause that makes enforcement politically dangerous." He paused. "Valdris has been searching for a specific document, one that would allow him to renegotiate the Accord's territorial provisions in the court's favor. If that document exists in this school's archives, and if he believes you have found it or are close to finding it, then the blood law provision gives him leverage." Marina was very quiet for a moment, then she said, "The addendum I found had a secondary seal on the back page. Red wax. Old. I didn't recognize it. Zarek's blood, which did not move through him the way human blood moved, felt suddenly and intensely cold." "Describe it," he said. "2 serpents crossing over a crown," she said. "The crown had 7 points. He stood up." He stood up before he could think better of it, and Marina stood too, reflexively, reading the shift in his posture, the way someone reads a change in weather. Her hand came up instinctively to hold her papers against her chest, and the gesture was so human and so steady that it hit him somewhere beneath the careful architecture he had built over centuries. "That seal," he said, "is the Nightblood Compact. An agreement made between the original Vampire Court founders before the Accord was ever written. It contains provisions that supersede the Meridian Accord entirely, including a provision that grants the Eastern Court sovereign claim over any neutral territory where the compact seal is displayed." He looked at her. "If that document has the compact seal on it, Valdris is not looking for leverage. He is looking for a takeover mechanism. And if you have touched that document, you are not just a complication. You are a witness to something that could destabilize the entire coexistence agreement." Marina Winslow absorbed this information with the precise expression of someone who had suspected the situation was bad and was now processing the confirmation that it was considerably worse. She breathed once, slowly, and then she said, "All right. What do we do?" The "we" landed against him like something physical. "You should understand," he said carefully, "that if I help you, I am in violation of a direct order from my commanding elder. The blood law codes that govern vampire guards are not gentle on violations of that nature. The standard response to a guardsman who breaks an order of this level and assists a human witness is execution by the court. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "I understand, and I am asking anyway, because whoever made that phone call to me tonight is going to escalate, and I have 17 students in this school who have no idea what kind of danger is sitting one corridor away from them every evening." He stood in the low light of the eastern corridor and looked at this human woman who had read documents she was not supposed to find, decoded implications that should have taken someone with court training weeks to unravel, correctly identified both her danger and her options, and was now asking him to choose between 6 centuries of duty and a loyalty he had not yet given, but somehow already felt forming. "The document needs to move," he said. "If Valdris sends someone to retrieve it and finds it already gone, he loses his mechanism. The question is where you take it." "There is someone I know," Marina said. "A professor at Westbridge University. She studies vampire law academically, from the human side. Her name is Elara June, and she has connections to the Accord's Human Oversight Committee. If she presents it to the Human Oversight Committee, it becomes a diplomatic incident rather than a covert retrieval," Zarek said. "Valdris cannot use court jurisdiction over an active diplomatic document." "Then that is the plan," Marina said. She said it the way she had said everything else tonight, with the particular brand of calm that was not the absence of fear but the decision to act regardless of it. "Can you get me to the archive room without triggering whatever monitoring he has set up?" "Yes," Zarek said. And then, because it had been building for 9 nights and the corridor was dim, and she was looking at him like he was the most trustworthy person in a very dangerous world, he said, "You should know that I am going to keep you safe regardless of what happens to me." Marina looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I knew that on the first night." The archive room was on the opposite end of the east wing. Past 2 monitoring points that Zarek knew the positions and rotation schedules of, with the precision of a man whose survival had always depended on knowing exactly where the watchers were placed. He moved through the corridor ahead of Marina, keeping her in his peripheral vision at all times, matching his pace to her ability rather than his own, which required more restraint than anything he had managed in recent memory. She was quick and quiet. She had worn practical shoes, he noted, dark leather flats that made almost no sound on the stone floor, and he found himself wondering whether that had been deliberate. He stopped her with one hand very lightly on her arm, barely contact, outside the second monitoring point. She stopped immediately. She did not ask why. She waited. That waiting, that precise and self-disciplined waiting, was something he had seen in trained vampire soldiers and almost never in humans. The monitoring device, a newer installation that Valdris had approved 2 weeks ago, used ultrasonic frequency to detect presence in the corridor. It had a gap in its coverage arc on the left as the installation had been done hastily, and the technician had failed to account for the wall's stone density. Zarek had discovered this gap on day 2, and had said nothing about it because the information had felt, even then, like something he might need. He guided Marina through the gap without touching her again, only a gesture, a slight angle of his head, and she read it and moved correctly. They were past it in 6 steps. The archive room door was old iron-banded wood, and the lock was, as Marina had noted, very old. She had it open in under a minute, using a tension tool she produced from her blazer pocket, with the air of someone who had prepared for this possibility. He raised one eyebrow. She gave him a brief look that was approximately 90% composed and possibly 10% pleased with herself. Inside, the archive room was cold and smelled of old paper and wax, and the particular deep mustiness of documents that had been sitting in a climate that was better for preservation than for human comfort. Marina went directly to a specific shelf without hesitation, reached behind a row of older ledgers, and withdrew a flat document case made of oiled leather. She opened it. The document inside was exactly as she had described, sepia with age. Formal court script in 3 languages, and at the bottom of the back page, a red wax seal bearing 2 crossing serpents and a 7-pointed crown. Zarek looked at it and felt something ancient shift in his awareness. He had heard of the Nightblood Compact. He had been told, as all court guardsmen were told, that it was legend, a story invented to give the early courts a sense of founding mythology. He had never been given any reason to believe it was a real physical document that had survived into the modern era, but he could feel it. The way a vampire of sufficient age could feel objects saturated with court power. The way battlefields felt different from gardens even centuries after the fighting was done. The document hummed at a frequency that made his teeth ache faintly. It was absolutely real, and it was absolutely as dangerous as he had told Marina it was. "We need to leave now," he said. Marina was already resealing the leather case. She tucked it under her arm with her papers and looked at him, and he noticed that her heartbeat, which he had been monitoring involuntarily since the corridor, was elevated but steady. Controlled. She was afraid, and she was functioning beautifully regardless. They were halfway back through the east wing when the lights went out. Not a power failure, a deliberate cut. Zarek knew the difference because the emergency lighting, which should have activated automatically, did not come on either. Someone with access to the school's electrical system had killed the entire wing. He moved without thinking. He was at Marina's side and then slightly in front of her, in a motion that required no decision, only instinct so old it lived beneath reason. His hand found her wrist in the dark, not gripping, just present, a point of contact that she could orient herself around. "Do not let go," he said quietly. "Not planning to," she said. Her voice was steady. He could feel the rapid pound of her pulse against his fingers, and it made something in him intensify in a direction he did not have time to analyze. He could see in the dark, not perfectly, but well enough. The east corridor had 4 entry points, and the one to their left was the one that mattered because he could hear, at the edge of his range, footsteps that were too quiet and too measured to be human. At least 2 of them. Possibly 3. Court enforcers. Valdris had moved faster than Zarek had anticipated, which meant either the Elder had been watching Zarek's behavior more closely than Zarek had realized, or there was a second monitoring system that Zarek had not found. Either way, the trap had closed, and the hidden motive behind the original assignment was now entirely clear. Zarek had not been sent here to guard the perimeter. He had been sent here as bait, to be the one who engaged with the human teacher, so that when she was removed and the document retrieved, Zarek's violation of his orders would make him complicit, silenceable, expendable. He had been set up by his own commanding elder, and Marina Winslow had accidentally walked into the center of a court betrayal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the power struggle that had been building in the Eastern Court for the past 18 months. "There is an exit," he said, "south end of this wing. It opens to the maintenance yard and then the outer gate." "I know it," she said immediately. "I use it when I work late." Of course she did. He moved them quickly, keeping her close and to his left, putting himself between her and the direction of the footsteps. In the dark, he was faster than any of Valdris's enforcers because he was older than all of them, and age in vampire terms meant capability in ways that court rank only partially reflected. But he would not be faster than all 3 simultaneously if they separated and flanked. They needed the exit before the flanking happened. The south door opened from inside without a key. Marina pushed through it, and they were in the cold night air of the maintenance yard, stone walls on 3 sides, and the iron gate at the far end. Zarek pulled the door shut behind them and heard the lock engage, which would slow the pursuit by maybe 40 seconds. "My car is on the street," Marina said. "They will watch your car," he said. "Then we walk," she said without hesitation. They crossed the left yard quickly, and Zarek vaulted the iron gate without effort, and then steadied it for Marina, as she climbed it with the focused physicality of someone who was fit and unafraid of scraping her palms. She dropped to the pavement on the other side and immediately started moving, and he fell into step beside her, close enough to act if required, with the leather document case now held against her body under her blazer. The city around them was late-night quiet, amber streetlights, and the distant sound of traffic, and they walked at a pace that was urgent without being conspicuous, and Zarek registered with deep inconvenient clarity that he had not walked beside a person this way, side by side as equals, in a very long time. "My phone," Marina said. "I can call Elara Dune right now. She will meet us tonight if I tell her what we have." "Use mine," he said, and produced a phone from his jacket, She looked at it briefly, registering the old-world quality of the case alongside entirely modern technology, and took it from his hand. Their fingers met in the exchange, and neither of them moved away quickly. She made the call. Elara June answered on the second ring, and the conversation was brief and significant. And by the end of it, they had a meeting point, a university safe room that the Oversight Committee maintained specifically for sensitive diplomatic materials, 40 minutes away. "She has a car," Marina said, returning his phone. "She will meet us at Westbridge's north entrance." "Good," Zarek said. He paused, scanning the street ahead. "You should understand that once this document is in the committee's hands, Valdris's legal mechanism is gone, but his motivation is not. He will be angry, I know," Marina said. "He may redirect that anger. At me," she said, "not a question." "At both of us," he said. "I am in violation of an elder's direct order. The blood law codes allow for a challenge to my service standing, which in practical terms means I can be removed from court protection." Marina stopped walking. She stopped and turned to look at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, processing the information, calculating implications, and containing something that looked, in the Alpha streetlight, very much like it cared about what happened to him specifically. "Is there anything that protects you?" she asked. "Any provision in the codes?" He was quiet for a moment. "There is an ancient vow provision," he said. "The covenant of witness. If a guardsman can demonstrate that their violation of orders was necessitated by a superior threat to the Accord's integrity, the blood law violation is superseded by their duty to the Accord itself. But it requires a court hearing, and Valdris controls the Eastern Court." "Then we take it to the Full Accord Council," Marina said. "The Accord has a joint review body, human and vampire representatives together. If we are presenting the Nightblood Compact to the Human Oversight Committee, we request a simultaneous joint review session." She looked at him steadily. "Valdris cannot run the hearing if it is a joint session. He becomes a respondent rather than a judge." Zarek looked at this woman who had, in the span of one night, decoded a centuries-old power play, retrieved a document that most vampires believed was fiction, identified a path through vampire blood law code using a provision that most practicing court officials had forgotten existed, and was now standing on a nighttime street, with chalk dust still on her sleeve, proposing to take on an elder vampire, through the formal mechanisms of a coexistence treaty she had taught herself by reading archived documents in a locked room. "You are extraordinary," he said. He had not planned to say it. It arrived without consultation. Marina looked at him, and in the amber light something crossed her face that was very honest and very warm, and she said, "You have been out there for 9 nights. You could have ignored me properly. You chose not to." "You made it impossible," he said. "Good," she said softly, and they started walking again, and the distance between them had somehow, without negotiation, reduced by several inches. Elara June was a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of emergency for several years, and was grimly relieved it had finally arrived. She met them at the north entrance of Westbridge University, looked at Zarek with the assessing glance of an academic who had spent 30 years studying what he was without ever expecting to be standing next to one, and then looked at the leather case under Marina's arm and said, "Let us go inside." The safe room was in the basement of the library, behind a wall of archival storage that moved on a track. It was temperature-controlled and lined with documents and lit with the kind of careful light that preserved old paper, and it felt, despite everything, like a room Marina would have loved under any other circumstances. Zarek watched her face as they entered and saw the brief, involuntary appreciation before she put it aside. Elara examined the Nightblood Compact for 11 minutes in focused silence, while Marina explained the night's events concisely, and Zarek stood near the door with the particular quality of stillness that was not inaction but readiness. When Elara set the document down, she removed her glasses from her head and cleaned them in a way that suggested she was processing something large. "This document, if authenticated, voids the Meridian Accord's neutral territory provisions entirely," she said. "Which means Lord Valdris Nocturne has been sitting on a mechanism that would have given the Eastern Court legal claim to approximately 40% of the neutral zones in this region." "He did not sit on it," Zarek said. He recently discovered it was here. That is why the school's archive room was set up for monitoring. He was searching for it. Then he does not know we have it yet, Elara said. He knows we left the school with something, Zarek said. His enforcers arrived less than an hour after Marina accessed the archive room. He knows it is gone. He simply does not know where. Then we move tonight, Elara said with decision. I have the direct contact for the Accord's Joint Review Secretariat. A joint emergency session can be convened within 72 hours if a compact-level document is submitted as evidence. She looked at Zarek. And you need to submit a formal covenant of witness claim alongside the document submission. Tonight, if possible, before Valdris can file a blood law violation against you through Eastern court channels. Can she do that? Marina asked, looking at Zarek. The covenant of witness submission needs to be witnessed by a non-court human palm party with documented standing, Zarek said. Elara Dune has a court oversight committee standing. I do, Elara affirmed. Sit down, both of you. We have paperwork to do. The next 3 hours were not what Zarek would have predicted his night contained. He sat at a library table across from Marina Winslow while Elara Dune produced an extraordinary number of formal documents from a filing system that was aggressively organized, and they worked through the submission requirements for both the Nightblood Compact presentation and the Covenant of Witness claim simultaneously. Marina wrote with the efficient clarity of someone who was accustomed to generating precise documentation, and Zarek found himself watching her hands move across the paper with an attention that he could not entirely justify as strategic. At one point, she looked up and caught him watching, and instead of looking away, he held her gaze, and the moment stretched long enough to mean something. "How long have you been a court guardsman?" she asked. "I was assigned to the Eastern Court in 1683, he said. She absorbed this. That is a very long time to follow orders. It is, he said. I have been good at it until now. Do you regret it, she asked, breaking the order tonight? He considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved, because Marina Winslow asked questions and she wanted actual answers to, and she would know if he was being anything less than honest. No, he said. I regret that it put you at greater risk. I do not regret any of the rest of it. She looked at him for another long moment and then said, quietly, so that Elara at the other end of the table would not hear it, I am glad you turned around. Something in him that had been careful and governed and entirely too controlled for 6 centuries did something it had not done in a very long time. It opened slightly in the direction of another person, like a window in a room that had been shut against the weather for so long that the mechanism had almost forgotten its original purpose. I said equally quietly, So am I. The joint emergency session of the Accord's review body was convened 4 days later in the Accord's formal chamber, which was located in a building that officially did not appear on any public city map and sat directly on the boundary line between the oldest human and vampire territorial zones in the city. The chamber itself was designed with the particular care of a space that had to serve both species simultaneously. Vaulted ceilings and natural darkness balanced with carefully managed artificial light that was neither too bright for vampire comfort nor too dim for human function. Marina attended as the primary human witness. Zarek stood as the Covenant of Witness claimant. Elara Dune presented the Nightblood Compact on behalf of the Oversight Committee. Lord Valdris Nocturne was present as a respondent, which had clearly not been a position he had anticipated occupying. He was ancient in the way that only the very old vampires were ancient, carrying his years as a visible quality, something that moved around him like weather. He had white hair that fell in severe lines and eyes the color of old amber, and he looked at Zarek across the chamber with an expression that contained both fury and the specific calculation of someone who had not yet decided whether this situation was recoverable. His legal representative, a court official named Seren Vale, whose sharpness of manner suggested he had been navigating vampire court politics for at least 3 centuries, attempted 3 separate procedural challenges to the session's legitimacy before the joint chair ruled all 3 out of order with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen this approach before. Marina presented her account of events with the same precision she brought to everything, clear, documented, chronological, and unshakable under the questioning that followed. Zarek watched the joint chair and the oversight committee members receive her testimony with the growing attention of people who were realizing the thing they were being told was both true and significantly more serious than they had expected. When Seren Vale attempted to invoke the blood law provision and argue that Marina had forfeited her accord protection by becoming aware of vampire territorial matters, Marina looked at him with an expression of absolute calm and said, "The provision you are citing requires the awareness to have been obtained willfully in a manner that constitutes espionage under the Accord's definitions. I obtained the information because I was an employee of a school that was secretly being used as a vampire court meeting point without disclosing that use to its human staff, which, under Article 17 of the Meridian Accord, constitutes a territorial disclosure obligation that the Eastern Court violated by using the building. Any awareness I obtained as a result of that undisclosed use is legally the consequence of the court's own accord violation, not mine." The chamber was very quiet. Seren Vale looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just been outmaneuvered by someone they had not expected to be capable of it.
Article 17,
Elara June added from her seat, with the mild tone of an academic who has been waiting patiently for this exact moment, was included in the accord specifically to prevent this circumstance. The Eastern Court's legal team would have known this before assigning court activities to a school with an active human staff. Lord Valdris's amber eyes moved slowly from Marina to Zarek, and the look he gave Zarek was ancient and cold, and contained, beneath the fury, something that looked almost like reluctant acknowledgement. Zarek met his elder's gaze and did not flinch. The session lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, the Joint Chair issued a preliminary ruling that suspended Eastern Court jurisdiction claims in all neutral territories pending a full review of the Nightblood Compact's authenticity and legal standing, referred the compact itself to a 3-party authentication panel with equal human and vampire representation, upheld Zarek's covenant of witness claim which effectively removed the blood law violation finding against him, and formally censured the Eastern Court for the undisclosed use of neutral zone property. Lord Valdris left the chamber without speaking. Seren Vale gathered his documents with controlled precision and followed his elder without looking at anyone. In the corridor outside the chamber, Elara June shook Marina's hand, and then looked at Zarek and offered her hand to him as well, with the directness of someone who had made a decision about what she thought of him and was committing to it. He took her hand and shook it once. "Whatever authentication finds," Elara said, "the political effect is already achieved. Valdris cannot use this document covertly now that the joint body is watching." She paused. "You both did very well." She walked away down the corridor with the decisive step of someone who had a considerable amount of additional work to do and was already thinking about it. Marina and Zarek stood in the corridor as the session's other attendees filtered past them, and the formal quiet of the Accord chamber gave way to the ordinary noise of the building around them, distant voices, footsteps, the hum of a ventilation system that had been installed 60 years ago and maintained with careful regularity since. "It is over," Marina said, "not quite a question." "The immediate threat is over," Zarek said. "The political fallout will continue. The authentication process will take months. Valdris will not accept this gracefully." He paused. "But the trap is dismantled. He cannot use the compact covertly. He cannot use the blood law provision against you, and he cannot move against me without triggering a joint review." "He is still angry," Marina said. "He will remain angry," Zarek said. "But anger without mechanism is just anger." She looked at him, and there was something in her face that had been building for 4 days of preparation and testimony and relentless forward motion, something that was now allowed to exist because the crisis had passed, and she was not running anymore. "What happens to you now?" she asked. "The covenant of witness claim was upheld, which means you're not facing court punishment, but your assignment at Blackthorn is obviously finished. Your relationship with the Eastern Court is complicated," he said. "That is one word for it," she said. "I have been with the Eastern Court for over 300 years, he said. But the Eastern Court I was with was not the court Valdris has built in the last century. The honorable duty that original commitment represented is not what was asked of me at Blackthorn." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not sorry to be free of the Simon, and I am uncertain what that means for what comes next." Marina was quiet for a moment too, and then she said, "I go back to teaching Monday. My students will not know any of this happened. The school's East Wing will presumably stop having evening sessions, given the censure. Everything returns to normal." "For you," he said. "Not entirely," she said. She said it carefully. The way she said things she meant precisely. "You broke an order for me. You walked through a dark corridor with me. You sat in a library with me for 3 hours doing paperwork, which is objectively an extremely unglamorous way to spend a night, and you did not complain once." She looked at him with the directness that had been the first thing he noticed about her, and would, he was certain, be the last thing he ever forgot. "I do not think things go back to exactly normal for either of us." "No," he said. "I do not think they do." They stood in the corridor of an ancient building on a boundary line between two worlds, and Zarek looked at Marina Winslow with the full attention of a man who had spent 6 centuries being careful about what he let himself want, and he said, "I would like to see you again, not as a guard, not as an assignment, as whatever comes after this." Marina's face did something quiet and warm and entirely certain. "I would like that very much," she said, 3 weeks later. On a Tuesday evening when the first cold of autumn had arrived and the city smelled of rain and fallen leaves, Marina Winslow sat across from Zarek Drakul at a restaurant that occupied the ground floor of a building in the city's old quarter, a place where the decor ran to dark wood and deep upholstery, and where the ambient noise level was comfortable rather than overwhelming, which he had chosen with the deliberate consideration of someone who had thought carefully about the kind of environment she might enjoy. She had ordered coffee, and he had ordered nothing, which was the only obviously supernatural thing about the evening, and she had not commented on it because she was Marina, and she absorbed information and moved on. They had talked for 2 hours by the time the restaurant began emptying around them, and the conversation had moved through the kind of territory that only opens up between people who have already survived something together. The specific intimacy of shared danger giving way to the ordinary intimacy of simply knowing each other. He had told her things about the Eastern Court in its earlier days that she received with the focused attention of a historian encountering primary sources. She had told him about growing up with parents who were both academics and a childhood spent more in libraries than outside, which explained, she said, why she had grown up to be someone who breaks into archive rooms. He had told her that explained a great deal. Outside, the rain had started properly, coming down with the committed quality of autumn rain that intends to continue for a while. They were standing at the entrance of the restaurant looking at it when Zarek took off his jacket and held it out to her with an expression that was understated but completely intentional. Marina looked at the jacket and then at him and said, "You will get wet." "I do not mind the rain," he said. "I know," she said, "but so do I. Put your jacket on." And she walked out into the rain without it and turned back to look at him, laughing slightly at the expression on his face. And he put the jacket back on and walked out into the rain after her, and they walked the 4 blocks to where she had parked her car in a rain that was cold and persistent and entirely fine. And he was aware the whole 4 blocks of every point where their shoulders nearly touched, and the warmth that the nearness of her generated in him, which was a remarkable thing for a being of his nature, and he was not going to pretend it was not remarkable. At her car she turned to face him, rain on her dark hair, on her blazer, on the face that had been the first face he had truly seen in a very long time. "There are obvious complications," she said, "between us. The things that would need to be talked about and worked through, my life and your life and the ways in which those are not the same." "Yes," he said. "I am not frightened of complications," she said. "I know," he said. He had known that since the first night. "And I am not frightened of you," she said. "I know that too," he said. And then, because she had been honest with him and he owed her the same entirely, he said, "I have not been this certain about a person in 6 centuries. It is possibly the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me, which is considerable given some of the things that have happened to me over 6 centuries. Marina Winslow laughed, genuinely, the full unguarded version of it that he had not heard before, and the sound of it did something to his chest that was completely irreversible. "Good," she said. "I have been trying for a month to be sensible about this." "Has it worked?" he asked. Absolutely not, she said. He reached out and tucked one strand of rain-dark hair back from her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheekbone, the most careful touch he had given another person since he could remember. And she leaned into it a fraction, just a fraction, and looked at him with those steady dark eyes and something that was entirely unhidden. "Zarek," she said. "Marina," he said. And the rain came down around them, and he bent and kissed her. And she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, fully present and entirely herself, and the city went on around them, with its amber lights and its rain-wet streets and its ancient divided territories. And for a long moment the world was simply this, a specific warmth and rightness that 6 centuries had not taught him to stop hoping for, and one impossibly brave human teacher had made real. The months that followed were not without difficulty. The Nightblood Compact's authentication process produced a finding in its 9th week that the document was genuine, but that several of its provisions had been superseded by the Meridian Accord's signing, under a principle of later law precedents that vampire scholars had been debating for decades and human scholars had been largely unaware existed. The Joint Review Body issued a comprehensive ruling that established a formal hierarchy of governing documents, placing the Accord's provisions above the Compact, in all matters of territorial coexistence, while acknowledging the Compact's historical significance. Lord Valdris Nocturne formally contested the ruling through Eastern court channels and lost the contest in a session that Zarek did not attend but was briefed on, and which resulted in the elder being placed on formal political review by his own court's senior members, who had been made deeply uncomfortable by the scope of what the Blackthorn situation had revealed about Valdris's methodology. Zarek's formal separation from the Eastern Court's active guard roster was processed without opposition, which the Covenant of Witness claim had made possible, and he found himself in the specific situation of a vampire who has served one court for 3 centuries and must now exist outside that structure. It was disorienting in a way he had not entirely anticipated. He had known, intellectually, that his relationship with the Eastern Court had been fundamentally altered by what happened at Blackthorn. But knowing something and living it are different experiences, even for someone as practiced at managing difficult realities as Zarek Drakul. Marina noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything, quietly and without drama, and one Saturday afternoon, when they were sitting in her apartment, surrounded by the specific comfortable disorder of a space lived in by someone who reads constantly and gardens occasionally, and never quite finishes putting things away entirely, she set down the book she was holding and looked at him and said, "You miss it." "I miss what it was," he said, "not what it became." "Those are sometimes the same grief," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "they are." "What would you do," she said carefully, "if you could build something rather than serve something? If the question was not what structure you belong to, but what work you actually want to do?" He had not been asked that question before. Not in 6 centuries. He had always existed within a framework that told him what he was for, and the question of what he personally wanted to be for had simply not been a question that was asked. Marina, who had built her own answers to exactly that question in a world that had also frequently tried to tell her what she was for, asked it with the gentleness of someone who knew it might be a large thing to answer. "I want to do work that matters," he said after a moment. "Not court politics, something that actually protects people." "Human and vampire both. Elara Dune is building a liaison office," Marina said, "between the Oversight Committee and the vampire courts. She mentioned it when we had lunch last week. She needs people who understand both sides from the inside." She paused. "She mentioned you specifically." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had lunch with Elara Dune and did not mention it." "I was waiting to see if you would bring up what you wanted first," Marina said, "without me steering you toward an answer." He looked at her for a long moment, at the directness and the honesty and the deep particular care that she expressed through action and attention, rather than performance, and he said, "Have I mentioned that you are extraordinary?" "Once before," she said. "In a school corridor." "I remember it." "I mean it more now," he said, "which I would not have thought possible at the time." Marina smiled at him, the full version, warm and steady and entirely his, and he reached across the comfortable, book-covered space between them on her sofa and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat that way in the afternoon quiet of her apartment, while the city moved outside the windows, and everything that had been built between them. Through danger and choice and 9 nights of an impossible order, and one woman's absolute refusal to be ignored, held firm and warm and real, he joined the Accord liaison office in the spring. The work was exactly what he had said he wanted. Practical, meaningful, and built on the specific knowledge that a vampire of his age and background possessed in ways that no one else, currently doing the work, did. He was not performing service to a court's agenda. He was working within a framework that was genuinely trying to solve the problems that courts like Valdres's methodology created. And the difference was not subtle. Elara Dune, who had an extremely clear-eyed view of both the people she worked with and the situations she navigated, gave Zarek exactly as much direction as he needed, and then got out of his way with the confidence of someone who had correctly assessed his capabilities. He respected her enormously for this. Marina and Zarek moved through the months and seasons with the natural accommodation of 2 people who are genuinely compatible and willing to work at it. There were conversations that had to be had, honest ones, about the reality of what his nature meant for the long shape of their life together, about blood and sustenance and the ways in which that reality operated in the modern world, because these were not things that could be avoided, and Marina had no interest in avoiding them. She approached the conversation with the same intellectually engaged directness she brought to everything, asking questions, understanding answers, deciding what she could live with and what she required, and listening to what he needed in return. There were larger conversations too, about time, about the fact that her lifetime and his were measured in entirely different scales, about what that meant and how they held it, and what choices were available within it. These were not easy conversations. They were necessary ones, and they had them honestly. Over the course of many evenings and long weekend mornings and late nights when the city was quiet and there was no pretense available, only the 2 of them, and the truth of their situations, and the equally true fact that they wanted to be in it together regardless. The question of the future was one they returned to over and over, not with anxiety, but with the particular kind of ongoing negotiation that serious love requires when the terms of it are genuinely complex. Marina had thoughts about it, clear ones. She had characteristically done considerable research, both into what the Accord's legal framework currently permitted and into the historical precedents of human-vampire partnerships across the treaty period. She presented her findings one evening in the autumn of their first year, sitting at her kitchen table with notes spread around her with academic precision, and Zarek sat across from her and listened with the full attention he had given her since the night he had turned around in the east corridor of Blackthorn Academy. There was, she told him, a provision within the expanded Accord framework, one of the provisions added during the treaty's 1962 renewal, that recognized formal partnership bonds between human and vampire individuals and provided legal protections for both parties within that recognition. It was not widely used. It required joint documentation with both Accord committee and court representation. It was, however, real and functional and had been used 17 times in the 60 years since it was written. She was not, she clarified, proposing anything she had not already thought about carefully. She was presenting information and wanted to know what he thought. What he thought, Zarek said, setting down the notes he had been reading with the focused care he gave all documents that Marina produced, was that she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in 6 centuries of encountering people, and that the provision she was describing was something he had looked up himself 3 months ago, and had not yet found the right moment to bring to her attention, and that the fact that they had both arrived at the same research from opposite direction fronts without note about each other felt, to him, like the specific kind of confirmation that did not require any additional deliberation. Marina looked at him with the expression that was entirely hers, steady and warm and absolutely certain, and said, "So we are in agreement." "We are in agreement," he said. "Good," she said. And she gathered her notes with a brisk efficiency that made him love her with a specificity that was entirely new to him in the best possible way, and said, "Then I will contact Elara about the documentation requirements on Monday. The formal recognition was processed through the Accord's joint administration over the following months, with Elara Dune serving as the liaison committee witness and a court representative named Aldara Vesin, a vampire of moderate seniority who had no connection to the Eastern Court and had been personally suggested by Zarek, serving on the vampire side. The documentation was precise and thorough, and Marina reviewed every line of it herself, which the Accord administrators noted was unusual, and which the court representative noted was impressive. There was a small, formal witnessing, nothing elaborate, in a room at the Accord building that was warm with autumn light, and the specific quality of a space that had held many significant moments and held them respectfully. Elara was there, a colleague of Marina's from Blackthorn, a history teacher named Conrad Marsh, who had been her closest friend at the school and who had accepted the broad strokes of the situation with the pragmatic openness of someone who had suspected something unusual about Marina's life for quite some time, was there as well. Aldara Vesin attended with the composed dignity of her position and the quietly genuine warmth of someone who found the entire proceedings unexpectedly moving. Zarek stood beside Marina in that room, and they signed the formal documents, his signature in the ancient court script he had used for 6 centuries placed beside hers, in the precise and slightly angular handwriting she used when she was writing something she meant to be permanent. And when the witnessing was complete and the papers were properly registered, he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet after something so irrevocable and entirely right has happened. "How do you feel?" she asked him. He considered the question with genuine attention because that was what she deserved, and then he said, "Like something that has been in motion for a very long time, has arrived somewhere." Marina reached up and touched his face with one hand, her palm against his jaw, the warmth of her specific and grounding and real. "You are not under orders to ignore me anymore," she said. "No," he said. "I am not." "And you never could have anyway," she said. "No," he said. "I never could have." He turned his face slightly into her hand, and she looked at him with everything she felt unhidden in her expression. Because Marina Winslow did not hide things when she did not need to, and she had decided, somewhere in the east corridor of Blackthorn Academy on the night she walked out into a dark hallway and looked at the figure in the shadows, and did not run, that she would not hide how she felt about this person, this ancient, careful, dangerous, deeply honorable man who had turned around when he was ordered not to and had not looked away since, Zarek Drakul, who had kept himself at a careful distance from the world for long enough that it had felt like his natural state, who had served and observed and protected without ever allowing himself to be the person that any of that protecting was for, looked at Marina Winslow in the autumn light of the Accord's witnessing room, and felt, with the full force of 6 centuries of accumulated understanding, that this specific human woman had done something that no elder's order and no blood law code and no ancient vow had ever managed. She had made him impossible to ignore too. He kissed her in the witnessing room while Elara Dune made a quiet, satisfied sound, and Conrad Marsh said something under his breath that was probably congratulatory, and Aldara Vesin looked at the ceiling with the composed expression of someone who was genuinely moved and professionally pretending not to be. The world outside continued as worlds do, with its complicated politics and its ongoing negotiations and its ancient grievances working themselves slowly toward resolution, or at least toward management. The Accord's liaison office grew over the following year, taking on 2 additional vampire representatives and 3 human advisors, building the kind of structural bridge that the Accord had always theoretically wanted, but had lacked the specific combination of will and knowledge and institutional trust to actually construct. Zarek brought the will and the knowledge. The institutional trust he built encounter by encounter, case by case, with the particular patient effectiveness of someone who had 6 centuries of understanding exactly how trust is earned and why it matters. Lord Valdris Nocturne's formal review resulted in a managed transition of Eastern Court leadership to a governing council rather than a single elder, which diminished the concentration of power that had allowed his methodology to operate unchecked for the preceding century. The Eastern Court, under its new structure, formally petitioned to participate in the liaison framework the following spring, which was either a genuine change of institutional direction or a politically expedient performance of one. Zarek treated it as the former and watched for evidence of the latter with the specific vigilance that centuries of court experience made entirely natural. Marina continued to teach at Blackthorn Academy, where the Ace Corridor was now simply a corridor used by students and staff without secondary purposes, and where she remained the teacher who stayed late, graded carefully, built lesson plans with the thoroughness of someone who believed knowledge was the most important thing she could give anyone, and occasionally stood at the window of classroom 14 in the last hour of the school day, ought the not about the night a figure in the shadows had turned and looked at her and changed everything. The life they built together was not without its complications and contradictions, because lives shared across the distance that theirs spanned rarely were. But it was full, and it was honest, and it was chosen by both of them every day, with the specific deliberate intention that real commitment requires, rather than the passive inertia that sometimes masquerades as it. On a Thursday evening in the second year of their life, in the apartment they had made together, an apartment full of her books and his ancient objects, and the combined warmth of two very different kinds of being having found a way to exist in genuine harmony. Marina was grading papers at the kitchen table when Zarek came and sat across from her and set down 2 cups of tea, hers hot and his simply warm because she had learned to make it differently for him and done so without comment, and she looked up from a student essay on the literature of the romantic period and looked at him with the full, unhidden warmth that was one of the things he had come to depend on as the truest measure of the world's goodness. A student wrote today, she said, that the romantic poets believed beauty was dangerous. They were not wrong, Zarek said. The student meant it as a criticism, Marina said. They thought beauty being dangerous was a flaw in the argument. I wrote in the margin that danger and beauty are not in opposition, that some of the most important things are both at once. Zarek looked at her across the table, across the cups of tea and the student papers and the ordinary furniture of a shared evening, and said, "What did you think they would say to that?" "I think they will think about it for a long time," Marina said. "The best ones always argue with the comments." He smiled at her, the full version which was not something his face had done easily for a very long time before her. "You are a very good teacher," he said. "I know," she said, with the particular comfortable confidence of someone who has worked hard at something they care about and arrived at honest self-knowledge about it. "And you are very good at what you do. And we are sitting here drinking tea on a Thursday, which is ordinary and perfect." "Yes," he said, "it is outside the apartment windows. The city moved through its evening with its amber lights and its complicated histories and its 2 kinds of people finding their way toward the lives they were choosing. Inside, the warmth held and the tea cooled at slightly different rates, and Marina Winslow picked up her student's essay and went back to reading, and Zarek Drakul sat across from her and was exactly where he was supposed to be, which was not the result of any order, was not the product of any assignment or blood law provision or court directive, was the result of one impossible, unignorable, extraordinary woman who had walked out of classroom 14 into a dark hallway and looked at the figure in the shadows and decided with the full clarity of everything she was that running was not an option, and a vampire who had been ordered to ignore her and had discovered, in the precise moment it mattered most, that some things were simply beyond any order to prevent, some things were simply impossible to ignore. The end found them there, in the warm quiet of an ordinary evening, fully known to each other and fully chosen, the dangerous and the beautiful held together in the particular grace of a life built by 2 people who had found, across every possible difference, the one thing that made the ancient weight of centuries and the brief bright flame of a human life, both bearable and magnificent, each other.